afternoon. We'll say evening and afternoon at the same time. You will go ahead and open up your Bibles to Matthew chapter 23. Matthew chapter 23. We're going to look through these a couple chapters of Matthew this evening. Matthew chapter 23. We'll begin in verse 34. Today we're going to look at these particular chapters, and we're going to ask just some questions about them. And notice the text. A lot of folks think that everything in this passage, from Matthew 23 verse 34 to 25 verse 46, is all surrounding the same event. They teach this doctrine, and actually there's two doctrines that kind of arise when that comes about. But it's the belief that all of this happened when it's either going to happen or has already happened in terms of the judgment day. They think that all of this is surrounding that particular event. What you have in the religious world is two different groups of people. You have folks who say that all of this stuff in this section, in Matthew chapter 23, verse 34 through 25, verse 46, that all of it has yet to be fulfilled. They teach this doctrine known as premillennialism, and we've talked about that in the past. They think that there's going to be all these signs before the rapture happens, and a whole bunch of different stuff in regards to that. Some people teach post-millennialism, which kind of differs just a little bit in timeline-wise. But then there's another doctrine in the religious world that says that actually, from Matthew 23, verse 34, all the way to chapter 25, all of that has been fulfilled. So you got some folks who say that it's yet to be fulfilled, and you got other folks saying that it's already fulfilled, all of it. But the question of the matter is that true? Or either one telling the truth on this? Again, they get mixed up and they combine two things that are actually occurring in the text. And we're going to notice that this afternoon. We're going to look at two judgments of Christ. That's what's being discussed here in the text. And we're going to notice there's a distinction between a particular judgment that actually ends in chapter 24 and then a different judgment that takes place later on. You see, in chapter 23, beginning in verse 34 and going through 24 verse 34, it talks about the judgment on Jerusalem. It's a prophecy of the things that were about to happen. So if you haven't turned over there already, turn over there to Matthew chapter 23. One of the things he's been doing here in Matthew 23, as he has been preaching, is he has given this long list of very firm rebukes towards the scribes and Pharisees. He's been constantly calling them hypocrites over and over and over again. And so by the time of verse 34, now he finally says this: "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city, so that upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar. Truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation." That's a key phrase to understand when you're reading through this text. All these things will take place in this generation. He's going to say that one other time in chapter 24. Then as we're reading through this text, what we're seeing is they were going to reject Jesus and his messengers just like their fathers did. That's what Jesus is addressing. I'm going to send you folks who are going to preach to you, and they're going to try their best to try and bring you to obey the gospel, but you're just going to reject them. You're going to reject them, and by that time, you're going to be guilty of the very sins your fathers were guilty of. He continues on into verse 37, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. In other words, Jesus said, I have been trying to save you over and over again, and you keep rejecting me. There comes a time when Jesus finally said, you know what, I've had it. But from this verse, we see that Christ is showing his desire to save the Jews living in Jerusalem. Some of you may remember our study in Romans. We came to Romans chapter 11, and it talked about how the Jews rejected Christ, and because of that they were taken off the tree, which is supposed to represent God's people, and the branches were. But what he says, Paul talks about how Christ, and there was a desire for those Jews to be grafted back in, for them to be saved from their rejection of Christ. And so Jesus is trying to save them. He's trying to graft them back in the tree. He says, I'm going to send folks to you, but you are just going to be rejecting me, and you're going to be rejecting the messengers. And so in verses 38 and 39 it says, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. He's referencing a time when really the judgment would come upon Jerusalem. For I say to you, from now on, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's pointing out that God's presence is going to leave the temple. And once that happens, once God's presence has left the temple, there's going to be a desolation on it. And he's pointing, remember the temple, all of Jerusalem, it was destroyed by the year 70 AD. And this is what he's referencing. This is what he's pointing to. You come into chapter 24 now. The disciples have heard some of this, or rather, they have heard this. It says in verse 24, verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple. So he's been telling this to everybody. He comes out of the temple now, and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. This is his declaration of how Jerusalem is going to be destroyed. It's a prophecy against Jerusalem. This is how his disciples responded to that. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came privately saying, tell us, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? If you pay attention to the words here, the disciples are asking questions about all this. But if you're paying attention, they're thinking all this is going to happen at the same time. But if you pay attention to how Jesus responds to this question, the end of the age, the destruction of Jerusalem and all of that, it's supposed to actually, he's going to answer it by showing that there's a difference. There's going to be, there's a difference between the two. There's going to be the destruction of the world. There's going to be that end of the world, the end of the age. And then, before that though, there's going to be the destruction of Jerusalem. And so he's going to be talking about this. And you see this phrase, signs of your coming. It's a kind of a metaphorical coming in this idea of he's going to come through the Roman armies to execute judgment on Jerusalem for their wickedness. And so again, the disciples are questioning Jesus about his words on this. They're trying to figure out what's going on here. What's going to be all the signs of this? They had three questions here. What's going to be, when are all these things going to happen? What is going to be the sign of your coming? And what's going to be the sign of the end of the age? And so they had those three questions here in this passage. And he's going to answer all three of them in turn. Again, he'll make that distinction between the judgment on Jerusalem and the judgment for all. And so as we continue on, the first thing he brings up is the fact that there would be signs that the destruction of Jerusalem was approaching. Looking over and continuing in chapter 24 of Matthew in verse 4, it says, and Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. Excuse me. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You are hearing of wars. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened. For those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all of these things are merely the beginning of birth pains. Let's just stop right there for a second. If you notice, he's saying that these things are just kind of starting up towards what's going to occur at Jerusalem. Again, it's all pointing to what would happen in 70 AD in Jerusalem. And there, we're seeing just different things. He says there's going to be false Christs that come up. You know, we have false Christs today, but this isn't in reference to those. I ran across all kinds of people that claim to be Jesus. We ran across a person here in Albany that claimed to be Jesus. He claimed that he was Jesus, and he was the reincarnated Christ, and he was separated from his real parents at birth, and just gave a whole wide kind of crazy story. But this isn't in reference to that. This is in reference to there being all these false Christs arising, and it's just the beginning. You're not coming to that destruction of Jerusalem yet. But it's starting to head toward that direction. He brings up the fact that there was going to be wars and natural calamities. With the natural calamity specifically, he mentions famines. You may recall the famine in Acts that was brought up that caused them to try and get a contribution together, disciples to get a contribution together to try and, really to assist the saints that would be in trouble because of this. And that would take place in the book of Acts. But again, that wasn't the end. Next time he brings up begins in verse 9. He says, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another." You know, a lot of people, we've discussed this before, but people say it's impossible to fall away. Right here it says before Jerusalem falls, there's going to be Christians falling away. The fact of the matter is the Bible clearly teaches it's possible. Verse 11, "Many false prophets will arise and will mislead many. Because lawlessness is increased, most people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved." Before the destruction of Jerusalem, there was all kinds of stuff going on. You had the stoning of Stephen, which eventually led to Paul's big ravaging of the church. People may have thought, oh, is this the sign of the destruction of Jerusalem? No. It's leading up to it. This is the process that's taking place towards it. They were going to be preaching and trying to save folks, and this was just going to be the response to it. The response of them killing. You may recall when Paul had been converted, back in, I think it was in the 50s AD, time-wise. But back when Paul was converted, and he had been preaching the gospel for years, by the 50s AD, he had come to Jerusalem. And he was preaching to the Jews at that time. And he was trying to bring them to Christ. But the moment he said salvation is coming to the Gentiles, away with such a fellow, they said. He should not be allowed to live. That was the response. They tried to kill him. Repeatedly, there were all kinds of attempts made on his life after that point. But that wasn't the end. Even though the saints would be persecuted and killed, you come into the book of Acts, you also see James the apostle being killed. He was beheaded. All of these things taking place. And according to traditions, you had different stuff Nero would do. Nero Caesar. He would, before the destruction of Jerusalem, he'd do all kinds of things. He would burn Christians alive to act as lamps for festivals he would throw. If I recall correctly, sometimes they would throw Christians into arenas and have them try to survive lions. I think some people even say they may have had bears, but I'd have to double check on that. You had all kinds of stuff taking place. The death of Paul, according to tradition. The death of Peter, according to tradition. Death of perhaps some other apostles. But what ended up happening was there was all this persecution. And Jesus just said, this is just leading up toward this. This is just stuff that's got to happen. It's going to happen. And it's just leading up to this destruction that's going to happen in Jerusalem. Of course, he then continued, and he said this for verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations. Notice this next phrase, and then the end will come. He's talking specifically about the end of Jerusalem, and we're going to see that as we proceed from there. But notice he says the gospel has to first be spread to all the world, then the end will come. Well, when did the gospel get preached to all the nations? Has it been preached to all the nations? Over in Colossians chapter 1, notice with me verse 23. Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, it says, if indeed you continue in the faith firmly, established and steadfast, and not move away from the hope of the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, was made a minister. Notice right there, Paul said, the gospel's been preached to every nation. It's been preached to all creation. Jesus said, first it needs to be preached to all creation. It needs to be preached to all nations. And then the end shall come. And so by the time Paul writes Colossians, by the time Paul is penning this letter, this is the time when this has been fulfilled. And here, the end of Jerusalem is not too far away. We continue on from that section. If you look back in verses 15 through 18, Jesus is giving a warning to the disciples. He's telling them this, and when you look at these, again, one of the things I want to point out is in these two judgments, there was this teaching, two different teachings, two different subjects being addressed, but both were going to save Christians. One was to save Christians from a physical death, which was going to take place at the fall of Jerusalem. And then the second one would save Christians for eternity. Eternal salvation. There's two different salvations being mentioned here. One is salvation from this physical death. One is salvation from eternal death. But if you continue on here, verses 15 through 18, he says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. You see, Daniel even saw this was going to take place. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things out that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. If you actually continue on, he starts saying, but woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. You see that phrase, though, there, that they were supposed to flee Jerusalem the moment, the abomination of desolation was seen. Some people ask, well, what does that mean, that word abomination? That word abomination actually means something stinks. We might say we might say it today similarly, like when you get the whiff of danger. But what was this abomination that was going to be seen? When was this abomination that they were supposed to see going to take place? What was it? Well, look over in chapter 21 of Luke. Chapter 21 of Luke, verse 20. He describes exactly what this abomination was going to be. Chapter 21, verse 20. In Luke's account, it says, but when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. And he goes on from there to talk about fleeing to the mountains again. The point, excuse me, the point is that the moment they saw those armies, the armies were the desolation. The moment they saw those armies, they needed to leave. You don't go back in the house and grab your coat, try and move out last minute. The moment that army surrounded Jerusalem, they needed to get out of there. Don't go back in and get your coat. If you're out in the field, get out of there. This was what Jesus was saying. This was a warning to try and save, it was a warning to save disciples from this physical death, this great destruction that was about to come on Jerusalem. I want to give you an idea of the timeline of the prophecy's fulfillment. By the time Paul had wrote what he said in Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, many people saying it was somewhere between 60 and 62 AD. And so allowing that as the most minimum amount of time, by 62 AD, the gospel would have been spread according to what Paul had wrote. Then, by 66 AD, four, six, so many years later, the first army, there was going to be 3 armies that came. The first army was going to surround Jerusalem under Cestius, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Cestius Gallus. What happened was the city of Jerusalem was attacked, but it wasn't completely destroyed. The moment they saw that army, that was their time to get out of there. The moment that came, the moment they saw that army, they needed to leave. It's speculated that some may not have left, but did manage to get out of there after this attack. But in 66, this is when that first attack happened on Jerusalem. It didn't completely destroy the city, but it did kill a few of them. It did do some damage. Then it came to 68 AD. A second army surrounded Jerusalem under the Emperor Vespasian. He was another Caesar at that time, if I'm recalling correctly. And of course, 70 AD comes along. The Vespasian army left around 69 AD. Then the third army would come in 70 AD. And they would surround Jerusalem under the command of Titus. Not the Titus of the Bible, this is a different Titus. But this was when the city was attacked and destroyed. And so by 66 AD, the Christians were supposed to be out of there. God gave them a 4 to 5 year heads up to get them out of there before this great destruction happens. Some people, like I said, they speculate that that there was some Christians in Jerusalem when it was attacked that first time in 66, but the ones that survived did manage to get out. Now, again, that's a speculation on historians, but that's just something that I throw in there for you. But when you look at this and you see that process, God is getting his Christians out 5 years before that final destruction happens. That was the point of the prophecy we're reading there, in chapter 23 and 24, was to get those Christians out of there. But you continue on. I just want to show you what happened at Jerusalem's destruction. I think this ought to bring us all to fear the fact that when Jesus has had enough, when Jesus finally decides a city needs to be destroyed, the destruction can be very gruesome. But there comes a time when his punishment needs to take place. There was a man by the name of Josephus who was a historian. He actually lived during the time, he didn't live during the time of Christ, but he lived during the time of when Jerusalem was attacked. Now, of course, if I recall correctly, he wrote this afterwards. But this is a description of what was going on at Jerusalem, what the aftermath was. In his work, The Wars of the Jews, he wrote the blood was larger in quantity than the fire. You see, they would use fire as a form of attacking. Sometimes they would put it, you may see a movie where they're using crossbows and they light the end on fire and send them up. It says that the blood was larger in quantity than that, and that those who were slain were more in number than those who slew them. The fact of the matter is, once again, this was judgment. These people had rejected Christ. These people had persecuted and were putting to death Christians. And this is what happens when Jesus said, you know what, I've had it with you. There's actually a passage that says, within Wars of the Jews, it was either in the same area or in a different section of the book, he would actually say that the blood was so enormous that it was putting out the fire. Of course, that could be an exaggeration on his part. Another thing he would say about this, the multitude of those that perished exceeded all the destruction that either man or God ever brought upon the world. Now, perhaps he's exaggerating here, of course, when you take into account that God destroyed the entire world with a flood at one point. But this just goes to show you how great that destruction was. Once again, this was punishment for the wickedness of the Jewish nation. And another thing, there would have been a lot of Jews in the city at this time, because this was, if I recall correctly, this was 3 days before Passover. And I can be corrected on this, but I believe it was 3 days before that Passover. This is what he says at the end. For the ground did nowhere appear visible for the dead bodies that lay on it. Imagine going into a city, not even being able to see the ground because it's covered in the bodies of several people who've just been killed with the sword. That's the scene that Josephus describes when God made his judgment on Jerusalem. Now, Josephus didn't think this was a judgment on Jerusalem. But his words describe what that judgment looked like. You continue on in the passage, though, of Matthew. Tribulation was coming to Israel. Looking over at verses 19 through 20, we see exactly what that tribulation looked like. Matter of fact, Josephus even mentions in one of those sections at a certain point that some people in Jerusalem had died of famine. There was a type of famine going on during the destruction of Jerusalem. I think it was, if I recall correctly, it was during that the attack of 70 A.D. Romans were going into houses and finding all these people that were already dead from famine. So that's just something to understand there. All this is all of this is part of the judgment of Christ on Jerusalem for their wickedness, for persecuting the saints. Verses 19 through 22 says, "But woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray," verse 20, "but pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Until those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect," it's talking about Christians. This isn't talking about unconditional election. This is a reference to Christians who've been, you might say, conditionally elected. The elect, for the sake of the elect of those days, will be cut short. In other words, this wasn't going to take a super long period of time. This wasn't going to go on and on and on. God was going to cut this short for the sake of his people. That is Christians. Verse 23, "Then if anyone says to you, 'Behold, here is the Christ,' or 'There he is,' do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Show all these signs and wonders to try and lead even Christians to fall away." Verse 25, "Behold, I have told you in advance." He's going to continue on from there. But basically, he's telling, listen, there's going to be people saying Jesus has returned. Or they're going to say that Christ is here. They're going to say, there's a prophet here. We're going to be saved. Don't worry. Jerusalem isn't going to be destroyed. Matter of fact, Josephus even mentions, he references one of these prophets. It says a false prophet made a public proclamation in the city that God commanded them to get up upon the temple, and that there they should receive miraculous signs of their deliverance. Get up on the temple. There's going to be signs shown. We're going to be delivered. Get on the temple. That's what this particular false prophet was saying. And the people that joined him would have died. Truth of the matter is, these false Christs were going to lead people to die in Jerusalem on that judgment, that particular judgment, that first judgment referenced by Christ in this passage. You continue on into verse 26. It says, so if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out. Or behold, he is in the inner rooms. Do not believe them. For just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Again, he's going to be coming with the Roman armies to destroy Jerusalem, and using the Roman armies to accomplish his will, accomplish this punishment. Someone once wrote this book. I don't agree with it entirely, but he wrote a particular commentary on Revelation. He did a good job, a lot of good stuff on it. But he says that Revelation was written before 70 AD. I don't agree with that. But he entitled his commentary on Revelation, The Avenging of the Apostles and Prophets. That's what God does. He avenges his people. You remember the passage in Romans chapter 12 where he said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. God enacts vengeance on those who persecute his people. That's seen throughout the scriptures. That one particular vengeance in Revelation is going to be really directed toward those who would be living in 90 AD in that particular time period. This particular vengeance is taking place because of the Jewish persecution on Christians. So that's just something to make a note of. But if you continue on, it says, for just as the lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Verse 28, wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. But immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. In other words, he's telling them, listen, there's going to be false Christ saying, go over here, he's over here in secret, come over here. That's not going to be the case. Christ's coming in judgment on Jerusalem was going to be observed by all. It was not going to be some secret. When you see these particular, and I did want to make this note real quick. When you see these particular words being used, this verbiage of sun, moon, and stars failing, really this is just prophetic expressions of divine judgment. It doesn't necessarily refer to the judgment day. For example, Isaiah 13 verse 10. It's a description of judgment on Babylon. When Babylon was destroyed, the sun, moon, and stars didn't do all that. Not literally. This is prophetic expressions being used. Isaiah 34, 4 through 5. Idumea was destroyed. We're not going to look at these for the sake of time. We're not going to read these for the sake of time. He says it in Ezekiel concerning Egypt. He says it in Isaiah concerning Egypt, over and over again. It's just a proclamation of divine judgment on these particular nations. They're not literal sun, moon, and stars falling down on the earth, on the physical earth. That's something we have to understand. All these things, we're going to see verses 32 through 34, the destruction of Jerusalem would be fulfilled in the apostles' generation. Let's notice this real quick. Verse 32. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. In other words, listen, you start seeing the leaves start to blossom on that tree. That's a sign that, well, that's a sign that summer's coming. He says, when this happens, that judgment on Jerusalem's about to happen. When all these signs occur, that judgment on Jerusalem's about to happen. Truly I say to you, this generation, verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. If what we've read so far is stuff that has yet to happen, I'd like to meet some people that are 2,000 years old. The truth is, there just aren't. These things have already been fulfilled. The Bible says all of this has been fulfilled. But then he starts on the judgment day now. Look in verse 35. He starts talking about the judgment of all. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But on that day, but of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father knows. What day and hour? What's he talking about here? Well, he's talking about when heaven and earth pass away. That's the context of this statement. But of that day. So now he's answering that question about the end of the age. Listen, my coming and when I do that, and the signs of the destruction, all of that's going to happen in your lifetime. But when heaven and earth pass away, when the end of the age comes, that's going to be something different. You're not going to be able to see it. He continues on. You see these references here. But of that day and hour no one knows. Or, excuse me, my apologies. Verse 37. For the coming of the Son of Man. So now, this is a different coming of the Son of Man. Will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days, before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until that day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will the coming of the Son of Man be. And there will be two men in the field. One will be taken, one will be left. Two men will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken, and one will be left. Listen, there were no signs of that flood. It was just a sudden thing. Now this is this is the point. No signs will be given of the final day. That's at the point of verses 35 through 41. And I want you to notice this. When he's referencing the destruction of Jerusalem, this is how you can see the distinction between the destruction of Jerusalem and the judgment on the world. Those days, plural, refers to the destruction of Jerusalem. You can see that in those various verses. Those days. Remember, it took 5 years. Those days. When the judgment day comes, it's not going to be those days. It's referenced as that day, singular. He's using that in verse 36. He's going to use that in verse 42 and verse 44. Of that day and hour, singular, not plural. And so he's changed the subject now, and you can kind of see the distinction between the two. And he says that there's not going to be any signs. The coming of Noah, or excuse me, the destruction of Noah, the world in Noah's day, my apologies. The destruction of the world in Noah's day, they didn't know it was going to happen. There were no signs that it was going to happen. It just happened. All of a sudden the flood took them. That's the way the judgment day is going to work. It's going to be a sudden separation of saints and sinners. Back there in verse 40 and 41, he says, listen, someone's going to be doing this. Two men are going to be doing this. All of a sudden, one's gone. Two women are going to be doing this. All of a sudden, one of them's gone. When judgment day comes, and it's time. There's no, it's judgment day, time to obey the gospel. No, there's none of that. By the time that the trumpet sounds, according to what 1 Thessalonians tells us, then it's too late. You better be ready. Are you ready? We need to be asking ourselves that every day. Moving on from there. These next verses we'll try and summarize in brief. We need to be ready for the judgment day. That point is made clear through chapter 24 through chapter 25. Specifically these verses right here. He's using several different analogies. The Lord will return like a thief, is what he says in the next verses. We'll read those real quick. Therefore, verse 42, therefore be on the alert. On the alert. For you do not know which day your Lord is coming. But be sure of this, that if the head of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have been on the alert and would not have allowed the house to be broken into. For this reason you must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Listen, the thief does not give signs of his coming. He does not give signs that he's coming to break in the house. What intelligent thief would do that? How would a thief leave signs of his coming? Does he pull up to the house and honk his horn at 3 a.m. at night? Does he start flashing his brights at the window? Does he knock on the door saying, I'm coming in to rob you? Does he come on in saying, I'm going through your stuff? A thief doesn't give signs. He doesn't give signs of his coming. That's the way the judgment day is going to be. Continue on from there. You can see the Lord's going to return as an unexpected master. He uses the analogy of one. He says the servant who the Lord finds doing what he's told him to do, he's going to be the one that's rewarded. Whereas the one that says, well, my master ain't coming back for a long time. That one that says that, and he starts disobeying his master's orders, well, he ends up being punished. Chapter 25, verses 1 through 13, you read the parable of the bridegroom. The Lord's going to return like a delayed bridegroom. You remember what happened there? You had the five foolish virgins and the 5 wise virgins. And what happened was some of them brought extra oil, some of them did not. And so they're sitting there by the gate. All of a sudden, here comes the bridegroom. Okay. Oh no, I'm almost out of lamp oil. What do I do? Can you give me some of yours? No, I've got some. There's not enough for both of us. You got to go in the city. You go out in the city. The bridegroom comes while they're away. They close the gate. They close the door. Those that were ready went in. The virgins that were ready, that were prepared for a delayed bridegroom, were ready. The others come back. Let us in. I never knew you. We need to be ready for the judgment day. There's going to be a lot of people that aren't. The Lord's going to return and punish the unprepared. That's seen from the parable of the talents. When you had the people that were given certain amounts of talents, the 2 of them came to him when he returned, gave back what he gave them with interest. The last one just said, I buried it in the dirt. The point of that is, what are we doing with the gospel? Are we hiding it? Or are we being good stewards of it? And then this point. The Lord's going to return and punish those who do not serve him or his people. Right there in chapter 25, verses 31 through 46. We see where the separation of the sheep and goats takes place. To those on his left, the goats, they enter into eternal destruction. But the sheep, the righteous, enter into eternal life. Why? Because they would serve God and they were hospitable and, willing to serve and help his people. And so what ended up happening was those who were willing to help his people, who were willing to serve and assist their brethren, those are the ones that would be saved. All of this points to 3 lessons that we can learn from these various words. Jesus as judge punishes the wicked. He did that with Jerusalem. He said, you know what, I've been trying to save you. I'm going to continue to try to save you. But guess what? When this time comes, I'm done. You're going to be punished. Sometimes God just has enough with people. He had enough with Canaan. That's why he sent in Israel to destroy them. He had enough with Israel. That's why he sent in Babylon to destroy them. He had enough. And you can see that throughout these passages. People being punished, all the wicked being punished. The slave that's not doing his master's will, he's punished. The slave that's not being a good steward, he's punished. The unprepared for the judgment day are punished. But at the same time, Jesus as judge is a rewarder of his people. Back to that destruction of Jerusalem. Anybody who was a Christian living in Jerusalem, if they heeded the words of Christ, and they had the opportunity to get out of there, they could get out of Jerusalem 4 or 5 years before that whole destruction of Jerusalem took place. They were able to save their physical lives because of that. But he's also a rewarder of his people when it comes to, the judgment day. Remember in the parable, let's actually just read it real quick. There in verse 45 of chapter 24. Who then is the faithful and sensible slave, whom his master puts in charge of his household to give them their food at their proper time? Blessed is that slave, whom his master finds so doing when he comes. Truly I say to you that he will put him in charge of all his possessions. He's a rewarder of people. He's a rewarder of those who do his will. You can see that throughout the rest of the passage, or throughout chapter 25. There's examples of that. He rewards those that are ready for the judgment day. Are we ready for the judgment day? I know I've said that a couple times already, but that's a serious question. Serious question that we need real self-reflecting taking place. We don't think, I'm a good enough Christian, I guess I'm okay. No, we need to do some self-reflecting if we hope to enter heaven. Of course, the last point there is connected with that. We need to be ready for that day. He's a rewarder of the righteous and a punisher of the wicked. What's going to become of us? What's going to become of us on that judgment day? Something for us all to take to heart. Perhaps you're not ready for the judgment day. Perhaps you're someone who's never obeyed the gospel. Once again, we've seen the great power Christ has. He used the Roman army to accomplish his will in destroying Jerusalem. 1 million Jews died that day because of their rebellion toward Christ, their rebellion to God. He will punish people. But at the same time, he's willing to reward those who are faithful to him. Is that a description of us? Are we faithful to him? If you have never decided to put on Christ, if you have never decided to obey the gospel, I'll tell you exactly how you can become a Christian today. You can do so by believing in Jesus, repenting of your sins, confessing your faith in Christ, and being baptized. Perhaps you have done that, though. And you realize that you're not living faithfully to God. You realize that maybe you will be thrown in with the wicked. Maybe you will be among those goats and not the sheep mentioned in Matthew chapter 25. Christ will judge. He destroyed Jerusalem. He judged Jerusalem for their actions. And if we choose to be unfaithful, if we choose to rebel against God, if we choose to deny him, then he will also deny us. Brethren, are we ready for that day? If your heart is not right before God, if you have obeyed that gospel, but you've fallen away, you can come back to him this evening by coming forward, repenting of your sins, confessing your sins, And we'll pray to God for forgiveness on your behalf. If there's anyone here that needs to obey the gospel, don't hesitate. If there's anyone here that needs to return to God, don't hesitate. Get your heart right with Him right now as we stand and sing.